On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we speak with Kerry McDonald. She is the Senior Education Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, the Belinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at the State Policy Network, and the host of the Liberated podcast. Stay tuned. Hello, viewers and listeners, and welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense. I'm your host for today, Joe Grabowski. I'm the VP for Evangelization and Mission at the Society of G.K. Chesterton. And as most of you hopefully know, we run a major initiative here at the Society for G.K. Chesterton, the Chesterton Schools Network, our chief initiative, the Education Initiative, Apostolate, which helps parents and community stakeholders get into the process of educating their own children and taking kind of back that power as educational entrepreneurs. And so we're thrilled to speak with a guest today who has an expertise in precisely that area of educational entrepreneurship, Kerry McDonald. Kerry, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
And just for our listeners' sake, they might not be familiar with your work or with the Liberated podcast and kind of your background. Why don't you just introduce yourself a little more than I was able to do in the intro?
Sure. You did a great job. I will just say that I've been involved in kind of education and education policy, particularly focused on emerging schooling models and innovative education approaches for a couple of decades now, and had a book that came out in the spring of 2019 called Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, that talked about the growth and diversification of the homeschooling population throughout the first couple of decades of the new millennium, as well as the advent of microschools and microschool networks that were sort of in the early stages in the 2010s primarily. And then, of course, a year after that book came out, COVID hit and schools shut down, and there was skyrocketing interest in homeschooling and various versions of homeschooling, microschools, which are sort of intentionally small, highly individualized private schools, and other kinds of low-cost private education models. And so I began writing even more about these programs to a much wider audience. I have a column regularly at Forbes.com as well as at the 74, where I highlight kind of the entrepreneurial parents and teachers across the U.S. who are creating these innovative schooling options for families. And in early 2022, decided to branch out beyond just print and just articles to launch a podcast called the Liberated Podcast, where I interview founders of schools, and was thrilled to have Dale Ahlquist from Chesterton Academy on the podcast in June. But just great to have that insight from the founders themselves. And the podcast started off just once a week, but within 6 months, I had such a backlog of these founder stories that I boosted the podcast to twice a week. And now I have nearly 250 episodes and still a backlog of these education entrepreneurs. So I feel like momentum is building, as certainly you've seen within the Chesterton Schools Network, particularly over the past 4 years, as more and more parents seek options other than sort of a traditional district school, and more founders are there to build them.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly can attest to that growth in interest and really a skyrocketing potential and possibilities on the horizon. You mentioned COVID. That was, of course, one of the great growth periods for us. And it was, I think, a twofold influence. One, you mentioned, was, schools shutting down. And so people looking for alternative options. But I think at least equal to that, if not more influential, was schooling going to this hybrid model where kids were now at home, and parents actually maybe started to see for the first time what their kids were learning, because they could kind of, peek over the shoulder at the Zoom class, or a lot of that kind of, there was more of an emphasis on homework and things, and people realized that they were just dissatisfied with kind of the offering that was out there. And it's a great thing. It's a great testament to what happens when you strengthen civil society, that we're able to kind of fill in for that need, and we don't necessarily need to turn the matter over to the experts or the bureaucrats.
Yeah, I think you're so right there, Joe. I think that Zoom school in 2020 and in some cases beyond really provided a window for parents into what was actually happening in their children's schools. And I talked to a lot of parents who said, "Wow, I could do better than this," or "This isn't rocket science. I feel like I can do something that's even higher quality, or find another program that could be higher quality and provide exactly what I want for my children's education." So there really was that catalyst. And of course, we started to also see sort of these spontaneous parent driven pods, learning pods that sprouted in the summer of 2020 that were called pandemic pods, but really, were sort of similar to what we would think of as traditional homeschool co-ops. But a lot more parents realized that they could approach teaching and learning in different ways, in much more kind of individualized, community based, family focused ways. And I think that that's just continuing as more and more families realize what is possible. So it's just such an exciting time.
It is, and I think long overdue, I would say. And if I may, this is obviously a Chesterton podcast, and I know sometimes the connection isn't made for those in our audience, or for those who have perhaps come to Chesterton from, his Christian apologetics, or from his Father Brown mystery stories, or they like his poetry, or they think he's funny and he's a good novelist. So where's the connection there? I would make it for our readers, if you'll permit me, just to read a brief quote, and I'd love your reaction to it. This is from his book, What's Wrong with the World, and he has a chapter in there called The Outlawed Parent. And readers, or listeners, excuse me, as you hear this being read, bear in mind, he was probably writing this in 1910 or 1911, around when the book came out. And I think it rings with a kind of tune of prophecy today. He says, "There's one thing at least of which is never so much as a whisper inside the popular schools, and that is the opinion of the people. The only persons who seem to have nothing to do with the education of the children are the parents." And then later on in the same quote, he says, "Modern education means handing down the customs of the minority and rooting out the customs of the majority. Instead of their Christ-like charity, their Shakespearean laughter, and their high Homeric reverence for the dead, the poor have imposed upon them mere pedantic copies of the prejudices of the remote rich." And I've always been so moved by that quotation, because it captured what I saw in a brief time, working in classrooms and educating, and being handed down departmental guidelines with quotas and a redefinition of canon and what it meant to be literate, or even numerate, capable with numbers, all these changing things that were being created in ivory towers of academia, and just didn't relate at all to the real life of the clientele they were supposed to serve. So I just wonder if you'd be interested in reacting to Chesterton's take from 115 years ago, and why it's still relevant today.
Yeah, it's such a great passage, Joe. I mean, I think it speaks to what we've seen over the past 4 years, certainly, of parent empowerment. I think up until school closures, a lot of parents were just on autopilot, right? That they sent their kids to the default assigned local school, didn't think too much about what happened there, were kind of going along with the crowd. And then with prolonged school closures and, like we mentioned, Zoom schooling, all of a sudden parents had to reassume responsibility for their children's education and really begin to think about their own preferences and values. What do they want for their children's education? How can they find a place that's aligned with those preferences and values? And that's what's been, really exciting for me over the past couple of years, especially on the podcast, is being able to spotlight these founders who, approach education with a whole variety of different models and methods. I have classical founders on my podcast. I have Montessori, I have Waldorf, I've self-directed, and more kind of traditional. And I think what's exciting, as we see this kind of broader marketplace of education options sprouting that are becoming increasingly financially accessible to families due to the expansion of school choice that's also been occurring at the same time that these schools have been sprouting over the past 4 years, more families are really able to find exactly what they want for their kids.
Yeah, I'd like to come back in a minute to that issue of school choice and sort of just the policy landscape and how that impacts what we're about. But before we go there, on that point of all of these different models growing up, this is another caution that I would just give to kind of the viewers and listeners. To we may hear some of these models and perhaps ourselves be skeptical of them. We might not. It isn't an endorsement to say necessarily that all these things are equally good or anything like that. But I think that where we could certainly agree is that we benefit as if you will consumers, but even more as, let's say, entrepreneurs who want to enter into the creation of things. We benefit from more competition. We benefit from a vibrant exchange of different approaches and ideas to kind of enter into contest with one another, and then we let those that are successful rise and prove themselves. And so, I think for those inclined to maybe be skeptical or see some of the approaches being taken and realize that's not their cup of tea, it's still a signal to us that this is something where now we at least even have a marketplace of these approaches and these ideas enacted in society. Whereas certainly when I was growing up, and probably when most of those tuning in were growing up, that just wasn't the case.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like we have so much abundance and variety in so many other areas of our lives, and we haven't had that as much in education until now. I mean, you just think about, you go into the grocery store, any grocery store aisle, you see variety and abundance of all different kinds of foods, and some of which, we might prefer and some we won't. And the same thing with our neighbor or our other grocery store shopper. There'll be things that other people value and prefer and need that we don't. And I think that's what creates, a sort of a peaceful coexistence, is when we're able to make these purchasing decisions within a decentralized marketplace of options, where we're not trying to impose our will or our preferences on our neighbor or on others. We can certainly persuade them that our preferences are superior and encourage them to take a look, but we can't force that viewpoint on them. And I think, again, that's what more and more families are realizing, that in many cases, public schools, just by the nature of their kind of one size fits all model, you sort of limit your ability to influence what's being taught, or to be aligned with a particular viewpoint or value system. Which is why, if we can decentralize education and make it more market based, we'll be able to enable families to find just what they're looking for.
Yeah, and again, the empowerment of sort of entrepreneurial spirit within this. We speak a lot at the Chesterton Society about localism and about the what was once kind of universal in society, the productivity of the home space being a place where one engaged in active productive economy of some kind on some scale. And one very simple way that because I get a lot of pushback when I speak about that in public or go into different audiences, and they say, well, it's just not the economic realities of today. And I appreciate that. It's very difficult to say, it's a bit of a false dream to think that everybody is just going to sustain a household off of an Etsy store or something like that. But one thing that you can do productively in the home is take a greater hand in your children's education. And that doesn't necessarily mean doing it yourself. That doesn't necessarily mean even taking such an active role, let's say, as to be on a board or to be part of a co-op or whatever. But it does mean having that interest, and as you put it very well, kind of in one of your earlier statements, not just setting autopilot, not just taking for granted that the offering there, well, it's what everybody else is doing. We don't approach buying a car that way. we probably nowadays, I mean, based on all of my friends and their strong opinions about gluten and seed oils and everything else, we don't approach buying dinner that way. So imagine just why would you invest in 12 or more years of your child's education that way? It's astonishing.
Right. And recognizing too that needs and preferences may change
Hmm.
throughout time as well, right? That what works for your child in elementary school might not work as well in high school. And that's where I think, again, the Chesterton School Network and the high school model that you've created there is just so attractive. Clearly, so many families gravitating toward it. I know when I spoke to Dale a couple of months ago, there were over 70 schools, a couple thousand students. I imagine you're even more than that now. It's just growing leaps and bounds.
It is. It's a constantly sort of changing pipeline of interest as we position schools to when they can realistically open. Sometimes I know that people get frustrated with, they ask us, how many schools are there? And it seems almost from day to day we have to check the numbers. But the reason for that is that we pay close attention to being realistic about this. We're not building castles in the air here. We're building schools, and that takes a little more foresight and planning than many would grant. So, we're careful about that and saying maybe not this fall, maybe the fall afterwards, or maybe we're not even ready to start active formation yet. Maybe you come back to us a little bit after you do some of the seed planting in your own neighborhood or in your own community. So that's important. But if we may now, I'd like to turn to that policy piece because
Mm.
I think that one, I sort of have a background in public policy advocacy and in family and marriage issues, but also just especially strengthening the family. So there was some educational overlap. And I know, especially in the United States, where you're dealing with the federalist system and you have in education, it's not just 50 jurisdictions. It's down to the county and the municipal level. So I doubt you could cut through all that complexity for our listeners, but maybe just give an overall view of the landscape and what you see as the most promising signs, but maybe also the things that you think our listeners should be aware of, without, let's not be too political, let's say, but like looking forward to the near future, for example, what they could be aware of and what they could be taking a more active attention in.
Yeah. I mean, so similar to the growth in homeschooling and microschooling pre 2020. And of course, again, Chesterton Academy being part of that, starting as a microschool with 10 students, I believe, in 2008 to again, now this massive network of schools. So that was happening pre 2020. And at the same time, we saw the growth of school choice policies that enable a portion of state allocated education funding to go directly to families to choose how they want to educate their children, whether it's a traditional private school or a micro school or a learning pod or tutoring services, curriculum resources, educational therapies, all kinds of different things. So we saw the advent of or the expansion of school choice policies pre 2020. And then, similar to how education entrepreneurship really boomed post COVID, so did this boom toward school choice policies. So since 2022, we've had now 12 states passing universal ESA programs, educational savings account programs, that are sort of the most flexible type of education choice mechanism. Again, kind of moving beyond just traditional private school tuition to all of these other ways in which a child can be educated, like microschools and tutoring services and curriculum. So we've seen 12 states now where that's universal, applying to every K to 12 student in the state. Typically, so the amounts vary from around, say, 4,500 in West Virginia to around 8,000 in Utah, but somewhere sort of in that price point. And that tends to be the price point for a lot of these emerging schooling models, sort of low cost, highly individualized schooling models. So it makes these programs much more affordable for more families, just by the nature of their lower tuition to begin with. So today we have 33 states plus DC and Puerto Rico that have some form of private school choice, again, enabling families to exit an assigned district school if they choose to for a private education option. And again, 12 of those states have universal policy. So that's, I think, the most exciting. I think that momentum is continuing. More and more parents, when they realize that these are possibilities, that there are these policies being passed in other states, are demanding that in their states. So I suspect that we'll see more of that. I think in terms of cautionary trends that we want to be watchful for, I think we always want to be watchful for encroaching regulation of these private educational models. And we see that to some extent now, where there's several of these states, for example, with universal school choice policies that apply to all kinds of different models, again, microschools or pods or homeschooling collaboratives. But there's several other states where you still have to be sort of a state recognized, in some cases accredited traditional private school in order to participate. And so I'd love to see more states move toward the models of places like Arizona and Utah, where there is much broader understanding of what education is beyond a traditional classroom, especially as I think more and more parents are looking for something other than traditional schooling, whether that's traditional public schooling or traditional private schooling. And then with that, as that expands, we want to just make sure that these schools retain their independence and autonomy, that they are not, through regulation, sort of brought back to a standardized schooling status quo, which was in many cases the reason that they exist to begin with, was to sort of try something new, experimental, creative, that meets the needs of the families that they're serving. So we just always want to be watchful for that.
Yeah, well, it's a great cautionary tale, and again fits very much with Chesterton's sort of warnings against when you make government bigger and you make social structures bigger. There's always sort of a threat to liberty entailed there, so it's important to know about. And you mentioned, of course, the school choice, the ESAs and things like that, the funding options, but that's something I'll make a direct pitch to our viewers and listeners about here in that context, that, sometimes with blessings, there's also a little bit of a, let's not say trade-off, but there's challenges that come along as things change. And with the increase in interest and the increase in competition, which is healthy for the ideas in the marketplace, that also means increased competition for funding and things like that. And so I would just encourage our viewers and listeners, of course, we have the Knights of the Apostolate of Common Sense, our wonderful monthly donors that help us support the work of the Chesterton Schools Network and what's going on there. But maybe you're more interested in something going on in your neighborhood, in your backyard, where you see some of these alternatives. And just know that the competitive space of organized philanthropy and large philanthropy is becoming increasingly challenging. So I would just encourage our viewers and listeners to pray about that issue and see where they might take a more active role, at least with their almsgiving and their charity work. Kerry, if you could maybe, we talked about the diversity in this area, but I think of people my parents' generation who would maybe be looking at this, and it's just so foreign to them because, again, maybe when I was growing up, and I don't know whether I lucked out or what. I do feel I got a good education, and it wasn't something they had to think too terribly hard about because of the options that were available. So we talked about the diversity, but could you maybe summarize some of the top level sort of commonalities that you see, or the common sentiments that are arising, just that maybe it would explain it to people who, from the outside looking in, they put their kids through school and everything, at least in their minds, turned out fine, from the local public school. What are some of the commonalities from the stories that you hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of factors that are leading to families seeking other options. Not only the growth of these options, so parents are more aware of what's available, and then the additional accessibility of these options with school choice programs. I think that's all contributing to families looking for something different. But I think fundamentally what has happened, and certainly what was accelerated as a result of the COVID response and school shutdowns, is just this recognition that, again, we have so much abundance, so much variety, and so much personalization in other parts of our lives. And yet education has remained relatively stagnant and standardized for generations at this point. And so more of today's parents are looking at kind of the schooling status quo and saying, gosh, I feel like we could be doing things differently and doing things better, and that we have so much innovation and individualization elsewhere. Let's bring that to education. And now that's possible. And it's thanks to education entrepreneurs. Again, many parents and teachers who, never thought that they would be running a school or some kind of innovative learning space. And then they go ahead and do it and realize so many people in their community want that. And it's rewarding for everybody.
Great. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of our time here, but we always ask our podcast guests, it's the most open-ended of question. If you had kind of one takeaway or one word of wisdom that you wanted to leave the audience with, that they could maybe walk away from this with, what would it be?
Yeah, I would say that if you're looking for other education options, you're maybe not quite satisfied with the current schooling situation for your child or the children in your lives, seek out some of these other models like the Chesterton schools or similar programs across the U.S. And if you can't find what you're looking for, don't be afraid to build it.
Excellent. What wonderful advice. Well, thank you so much. Where could, if our listeners were interested in finding out more about you or following your work, where can they find you online?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, you can visit me at the Foundation for Economic Education at fee.org/liberated.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for taking the time. This has been a really, really wonderful and I hope inspiring conversation.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
And thank all of you, our viewers and listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Uncommon Sense. Again, you can check the links in the show notes for some of the work that Kerry is doing and some of the things that we mentioned along the way. You'll also find there links to learn more about the Chesterton Schools Network, maybe now with a new revitalized interest in doing so. And of course, there will be that link to join the Knights of the Society of G.K. Chesterton, who are our regular monthly supporters who give sacrificially one of our recent guests on our Everlasting Man book club that we have weekly. Tim Strive said that he canceled his Netflix account so that he could become a knight. And, I can't say that I'm ready to cancel all of my streaming services, but I think that if we all do an inventory, we could find that maybe there are things that we could cut out in order to give to the good work that's being done, whether it be by the Chesterton Society or by others in our community. So I'd encourage you to pray about that, pray for us and our work here. Do hit that like button, hit subscribe, share this with your friends so that more people can learn about our work, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends. Until next time, God bless.